Psalm 112 is not merely a poem written centuries ago, it is a living declaration, a prophetic mirror reflecting what happens when a person chooses to fear the Lord and delight greatly in His commandments. It speaks to the deepest longings of the human heart, the desire for stability, peace, provision, honor, and freedom from lack. In a world weighed down by anxiety, debt, and uncertainty, this psalm rises like a trumpet call reminding us that God has always had a system of abundance, and it does not begin with money, it begins with alignment. The psalm opens with a powerful truth: blessed is the one who fears the Lord, who delights greatly in His commands. This blessing is not shallow happiness or temporary relief, it is a state of divine favor that touches every area of life. It is the kind of blessing that outlives circumstances, that stands firm even when economies shake and systems fail. The fear of the Lord spoken of here is not terror, but reverence, a deep awareness that God is the ultimate source, authority, and provider. When this reverence becomes the foundation of life, everything else begins to shift. Debt often begins long before numbers appear on paper. It starts in the heart, with fear of the future, pressure to conform, impatience for results, or reliance on human systems over divine wisdom. Psalm 112 quietly dismantles this mindset by showing us a different order. It teaches that when God is first, clarity replaces confusion, discipline replaces chaos, and provision replaces panic. The person described in this psalm is not driven by impulse or fear, they are anchored in trust. And trust is the soil where abundance grows. The psalm declares that wealth and riches are in the house of the righteous. This statement is not symbolic alone, it is intentional and specific. God does not shy away from the language of provision. However, this wealth is not rooted in greed or exploitation. It is the fruit of a life lived in harmony with God's principles. Righteousness here speaks of right alignment, right thinking, right action, right stewardship. When money is handled with wisdom, integrity, and generosity, it becomes a servant rather than a master. Debt loses its power when finances are no longer driven by fear but guided by purpose. Light arises in darkness for the upright. This line speaks directly to moments when bills pile up, when income feels insufficient, when the future looks uncertain. Darkness represents confusion, delay, and pressure, but the psalm promises light. Not borrowed light, not temporary relief, but divine insight. God gives strategies where there were none, opportunities where doors seemed closed, and favor where resistance once stood. Many people pray for miracles while ignoring the wisdom God is ready to release. Psalm 112 assures us that wisdom is part of the blessing of the righteous. The good person deals graciously and lends. This is one of the most misunderstood yet powerful lines in the psalm. It does not say the righteous borrows endlessly. It says they lend. This is not recklessness, it is overflow. Lending here is the result of stability, not struggle. It reveals a life so ordered by God that provision exceeds personal need. Debt keeps people in survival mode, but God's desire is movement, from survival to stability, from stability to sufficiency, and from sufficiency to abundance. Generosity is not the cause of lack, it is the proof of trust. The psalm goes on to say that such a person will not be shaken. Think about that. In a world where financial stress causes sleepless nights, broken relationships, and constant anxiety, God promises unshakable stability. This stability is not dependent on market trends or external validation, it is rooted in confidence that God is faithful. When you know who your source is, you are not easily moved by temporary shortages. Debt thrives on fear, but faith dismantles fear by anchoring the heart in truth. The righteous will be remembered forever. This speaks of legacy. Debt often traps people in short-term thinking, how to survive today, how to escape pressure now. God, however, invites us into generational thinking. Psalm 112 says that the descendants of the righteous will be mighty in the land. This means that the decisions you make today, how you handle money, how you trust God, how you obey, are not just about you. They are seeds planted for future generations. Freedom from debt is not only a personal victory, it is an inheritance. The heart of the righteous is steadfast, trusting in the Lord. This line is the backbone of the entire psalm. Steadfastness means consistency. Many people believe in God when things are good, but panic when pressure comes. Psalm 112 describes a heart trained to trust regardless of circumstance. Trust does not deny reality, it places reality under God's authority. When trust becomes habitual, fear loses its grip, decisions become clearer, spending becomes wiser, giving becomes joyful, and abundance becomes sustainable. Death often speaks loudly, but God's promises speak louder. The psalm assures that the righteous will have no fear of bad news. Imagine receiving an unexpected bill, a financial challenge, or an economic downturn, and remaining calm. This is not denial, it is confidence. Confidence that God is already ahead of the situation. Fear amplifies problems, but faith shrinks them by placing them in God's hands. When fear leaves, creativity enters. When anxiety quiets, strategy emerges. The psalm ends with a powerful contrast. It speaks of the wicked seeing this and being vexed, gnashing their teeth, and fading away. This is not about celebrating another's downfall. It is about understanding systems. A life built on greed, shortcuts, and selfish ambition eventually collapses under its own weight. A life built on reverence, discipline, and generosity endures. Debt may promise quick relief, but it often leads to long-term bondage. God's way may require patience, but it leads to lasting freedom. Psalm 112 is a prophecy because it reveals outcomes. It shows what will happen when certain principles are lived out. It cancels debt not by magic, but by transformation. It activates abundance not by chance, but by covenant alignment. When you choose to fear the Lord, delight in His ways, steward wisely, give generously, and trust consistently, you position yourself under a divine flow that cannot be sustained by human effort alone. This psalm invites you to examine not just your finances, but your foundation. Who do you trust when resources feel tight? What guides your decisions? Fear or faith? Are you chasing money, or are you aligning with purpose? God does not withhold abundance to test you. He releases wisdom to prepare you. The journey out of debt is often the journey into maturity, learning patience, discipline, and trust at a deeper level. Abundance, according to Psalm 112, is not loud, it is steady. It is not flashy, it is faithful. It shows up in peace of mind, clarity of direction, and the ability to be a blessing without fear. When God becomes your source, money finds its proper place. It no longer controls you, it serves you. Debt loses its authority when God's order governs your life. Let Psalm 112 reshape how you see provision. Let it remind you that God's blessings are not fragile. They are anchored in righteousness. They are sustained by wisdom. And they are released through trust. As you align your heart with God's ways, you will find that burdens lift, paths clear, and doors open, not always overnight, but always on time. This is the prophecy of Psalm 112. There's a life unshaken, a house filled with provision, a heart at peace, and a legacy that speaks long after the struggle is gone. God's promises of provision do not operate independently of relationship. They are activated when faith comes into alignment with righteousness, generosity, and a deep reverence for Him. Provision is not merely about what God gives, but about who we become in the process of trusting Him. Many people desire the outcomes of blessing without embracing the posture that attracts it. Yet Scripture consistently reveals that when the heart is rightly aligned, the hand of God moves freely. Faith is the entry point, but alignment is the catalyst that turns belief into experience. Righteousness is not perfection, it is direction. It is the daily choice to order one's life according to God's ways, rather than personal impulse or cultural pressure. When decisions are guided by integrity, honesty, and obedience, confusion begins to lift. Financial chaos often mirrors inner disorder, but righteousness brings structure. It teaches restraint where excess once ruled, wisdom where haste once dominated, and peace where anxiety once lived. God entrusts provision to those who are committed to stewarding it well, because righteousness proves that blessing will not be abused. Generosity is the visible expression of trust. It declares that God is not only able to supply, but willing to replenish. When a person gives with an open heart, they break agreement with scarcity and align themselves with heaven's economy. Generosity shifts the focus from preservation to participation in God's work. It is not about the size of the gift, but the posture of the heart behind it. A generous spirit creates flow, and where there is flow, stagnation cannot survive. God's provision often follows generosity because giving positions the heart to receive without fear. Reverence for God is the foundation that holds everything together. It is the recognition that God is the ultimate source, not income, opportunity, or human effort. Reverence cultivates humility, and humility keeps faith grounded. When God is honored above all else, priorities realign, spending changes, choices mature, and dependence shifts from self to God. Reverence quiets anxiety because it reminds the soul that nothing is beyond God's reach. A heart that reveres God does not chase provision, it rests in the provider. When faith aligns with righteousness, generosity, and reverence, provision is no longer forced or strained. It flows naturally. Blessing becomes sustainable because it is rooted in character, not convenience. God's promises are not delayed by unwillingness on His part, but often by misalignment on ours. The moment alignment occurs, resistance weakens and doors begin to open. This is not a formula, it is a relationship. And in that relationship, provision becomes a testimony of God's faithfulness rather than a source of constant worry. Debt is not only a financial condition measured by numbers, contracts, or deadlines. It is often a spiritual and mental burden that quietly weighs down the heart. Long before debt shows up in bank statements, it takes root in the mind through fear, pressure, comparison, and the need for control. It steals peace, clouds judgment, and slowly reshapes how a person thinks about the future. God never intended His people to live under constant anxiety or shame, and that is why His desire is not merely to manage debt, but to break its hold through trust and obedience. Spiritually, debt can become a form of bondage when it replaces reliance on God with dependence on systems driven by fear and urgency. It subtly trains the heart to look for quick relief instead of divine guidance. When pressure rises, prayer often decreases, and decisions are made in haste rather than wisdom. Yet God calls His people back to trust, not blind optimism, but confident dependence on His provision and timing. Trust shifts the focus from what is owed to who is able. It reminds the soul that God is not intimidated by lack, delay, or imbalance. Mentally, debt creates a cycle of worry that affects every area of life. It follows people into their sleep, their conversations, and their relationships. The mind becomes crowded with calculations, deadlines, and worst-case scenarios. This constant strain weakens faith and drains joy. God's word repeatedly calls for a renewed mind because transformation begins in how we think. When the mind is anchored in God's promises instead of fear, clarity replaces confusion. Solutions emerge where stress once ruled. Peace becomes possible even before the numbers change. Obedience is the pathway through which God untangles what debt has complicated. Obedience often requires uncomfortable honesty, disciplined choices, and patience in a culture that rewards immediacy. It may mean saying no where habit once said yes, waiting where impulse once rushed, and listening where pride once resisted. Obedience aligns actions with God's wisdom, and wisdom produces fruit that shortcuts never can. God breaks the power of debt, not by ignoring responsibility, but by guiding His people into order, discipline, and sustainable freedom. Trust and obedience work together to dismantle debt's authority. Trust invites God into the process, obedience keeps the process moving. As these two grow, fear loosens its grip, shame fades, and hope is restored. Debt loses its power when it no longer defines identity or dictates decisions. God's desire is not simply financial relief, but inner freedom, the kind that allows His people to walk in peace, confidence, and faith, knowing that He is faithful to complete what He begins. Abundance does not begin with increase, it begins with order. It flows naturally when a life is arranged according to God's wisdom, integrity, and compassion toward others. Many people pursue abundance as a destination, not realizing it is the byproduct of alignment. When God's wisdom becomes the framework for decisions, life moves from reaction to intention. Choices are no longer driven by impulse, pressure, or comparison, but by discernment. Wisdom teaches when to move, when to wait, and when to release control. In this environment, waste diminishes, clarity increases, and provision finds a clear channel through which to flow. Integrity establishes trust, both with God and with people. A life built on integrity does not rely on shortcuts or compromise, even when those options appear easier or faster. Integrity keeps the heart clean and the conscience clear. It creates consistency between belief and behavior, prayer and practice. God entrusts abundance to those who will not sacrifice character to gain it, because integrity ensures that blessing will be sustained, not squandered. When actions align with values, resources are managed with care, accountability strengthens, and stability replaces constant fluctuation. Compassion toward others transforms abundance from possession into purpose. God's blessing is never meant to terminate in one place, it is designed to flow outward. Compassion softens the heart and keeps abundance from becoming self-centered. It opens the eyes to needs beyond personal comfort and invites God into partnerships that extend His goodness through acts of kindness, generosity, and service. When compassion guides how resources are used, abundance multiplies in meaning as well as measure. What is shared grows, what is hoarded stagnates. When wisdom orders the mind, integrity anchors the character, and compassion directs the heart, life becomes a vessel God can trust. Abundance no longer has to be chased or forced, it follows, it shows up as peace in decision-making, stability in provision, and joy in giving. This kind of abundance is not fragile or fleeting, it is resilient because it is rooted in God's nature. A life ordered in this way creates space for God to move freely, and where God is free to move, abundance flows with purpose and grace.